Imagine one day you go to an ATM and discover a flaw in the system that lets you withdraw unlimited money. Money that's not even in your account. What would happen in that case? Assuming you're an honest and trustworthy person, the right thing to do would be to report the flaw and not take advantage of it. But what if the person who finds this flaw is just an ordinary guy who's tempted to take other people's money? That's where our story begins today, and we'll see how this guy exploited the flaw for months until he became a millionaire, and how it all unraveled in a way you'd never expect. Hey, what's up everyone? It's Shamsuddin here. Before we dive into today's story, I want to thank you all for the 20 views on the video I posted 2 days ago. As a thank you, I'm bringing you this true story, which honestly is my favorite one that I've produced. It's totally different from the usual bank heists or serial killer stories where you can usually predict the twists. Also, before we get started, I want to let you know that at the time I'm filming this video, my channel doesn't have any subscribers. So if you subscribe now, drop your name in the comments so I can thank you. And I'll also put your name on the YouTube plaque when I hit 100,000 subscribers. That's a promise. And I promise you, I'll keep uploading videos every day no matter what. Not just to hit 100,000, but because you believed in my channel, even though my audience is small. Alright, without further delay, let's get into it. So, our story starts with this guy who lived in Melbourne, one of the largest cities in Australia. Dan worked at a casino, a place where people gamble, and with gambling comes drinking and partying. That's the environment Dan lived in, gambling and alcohol. This is going to be important for how the story plays out. Anyway, through his job at the casino, he met the woman who would later become his fiancée. But this woman moved to a smaller town in Australia called Wangaratta, which has a population of around 30,000. Because Dan was attached to her, even though they weren't married yet, he followed her and moved to the same town. He had to find a new job to make a living. At first, he bounced around different jobs, working as a cleaner sometimes, a waiter other times, and that went on until he found work at a bar. So he went from gambling to working in a bar. His work history sounds exhausting and tough. One day, in 2011, Dan finished his shift at the bar and closed up. It was late at night, and he was supposed to go home, right? But no, Dan had a habit of going out with his friends to drink after work. So after finishing up at the bar, he headed to another bar with his friends to keep drinking. That was his life. That day, he went out with his close friend Mark. We don't know what Mark looks like, and there's no picture of him, but he's Dan's friend. They went to a bar in a hotel and kept drinking until they were drunk. When it got late, Mark decided to go home, so he left the bar, leaving Dan by himself. Dan was also supposed to go home, especially since it was already midnight. But after Mark left, Dan still wanted to drink more. So he opened his wallet to order something, but his wallet was empty, and his friend Mark wasn't around to cover for him. So where could he get money now? Drunk, Dan left the bar looking for an ATM. After a while, he found one that belonged to the National Australia Bank, NAB, the bank he used. It was 12:10 a.m. Remember the time? It's going to be important later in the story. Dan had 2 cards, a savings account card, where he kept his money, and a credit card, which he could use to borrow money. First, he put his savings card into the ATM, but unfortunately, his savings account was empty. There was nothing in it, balance 0. So all he had left was his credit card. Most of you know how credit cards work. They let you borrow money from the bank, but there's a limit. Dan's credit card limit was $2,000. The problem was, he knew he was very close to that limit, because he'd been spending on the card all month. But still, he decided to give it a try and put his credit card into the ATM. When he checked the balance, he found he had only $5 left before he maxed out his credit limit. But Dan, drunk, decided to try transferring $200 from his credit card to his savings account. He started pushing buttons on the ATM, entered $200 in the transfer amount, and hit confirm. Of course, the ATM was supposed to reject the transaction because, as we said, his credit card was at its limit, with only $5 left. And that's exactly what happened. A transaction error message popped up, and the ATM ejected the credit card automatically. At this point, Dan should have just taken his card and gone home. He should have realized the transaction failed. How could you transfer $200 from a credit card that's already maxed out? It doesn't make any sense. But Dan, still drunk, decided to put his savings account card into the ATM to see if the $200 had somehow transferred to his savings account. Of course, his savings account should have been empty. As we said, the balance was zero. But the strange thing was, the ATM didn't show the balance in the account. It should have displayed the balance on the screen, but instead, it said, "Balance not available at this time." Dan sat there, staring at the screen, confused about why the balance wasn't showing, even though it should have been zero. Still, Dan went ahead and selected the option to withdraw, typed in $200, and hit confirm. Instead of getting an error message or a insufficient funds notice, the machine gave him $200 in cash. $200 out of nowhere. This meant that the money he tried to transfer from his credit card had actually been moved to his savings account. But the credit card had already reached its limit, so where did this money come from and how was it transferred? When he tried to transfer $200 earlier, he got an error saying the transaction was invalid. Of course, drunk Dan wasn't thinking about how any of this was happening at the time. All he cared about was going back to the bar to keep drinking. So he took the cash and went back to the bar, where he stayed drinking until about 12:50. Remember the time. After that, when it hit 1 a.m., he left the bar and started walking home. But that night, it was raining heavily. Dan was looking for a place to shelter until the rain let up, and he found himself standing in front of the same ATM he'd withdrawn the $200 from earlier. The ATM was under a cover, protecting it from the rain, so Dan took cover under it. While standing there, even though he was drunk, Dan started thinking about what had happened. How did the ATM give him $200 when he wasn't supposed to be able to transfer anything from his credit card? What just happened? In that moment, Dan decided to try the same thing again. First, he took his savings account card and put it into the machine. Same thing. The balance didn't show up. Then, he took his credit card and put it in the machine again. He tried to transfer $200 from the credit card to his savings account, and the same message popped up. Transaction failed, and the machine automatically ejected his credit card. But Dan wasn't ready to give up. He put his savings card back into the ATM, and again, the balance didn't show. But he went straight to the withdrawal option, put in $200, hit confirm, and again, the machine gave him $200 in cash. Money out of nowhere. Dan kept doing the same thing with different amounts. $100, $80, and every time it worked. The ATM kept spitting out the money he requested, even though his accounts were empty. Dan ended up withdrawing about $2,000 that night and went home with his wallet full of cash. Of course, he was exhausted by then, so he passed out on the bed immediately. The next morning, Dan woke up and started remembering what had happened. At first, he thought it had all been a dream, but when he opened his wallet and saw the $2,000 in there, he realized it was real. He was confused. And the first thing he thought of was to check his bank balance because, as we mentioned, the ATM hadn't shown his balance the night before. When he checked his savings account, it was zero. Then he checked his credit card account, and it was still at negative $1,995, just like it had been. So basically, the account stayed the same, as if Dan had withdrawn $2,000 out of thin air. Dan decided to wait and see what would happen. Maybe the bank would call him, maybe something would happen, maybe the police would show up at his door. But that day passed, and nothing happened. No one asked him about it, and no one called him. The next morning rolled around. Over 24 hours had passed since the withdrawal. First thing Dan did when he woke up was check his account balance. Obviously, to do that, he had to call the bank. Some of you might be wondering why, so let me remind you, we're in 2011, and banking apps weren't as widespread as they are today. There was no app for the bank, so Dan called the bank and asked them for a statement to check his balance. The surprise was that his savings account balance was now minus $2,000. His credit card was still the same, minus $1,995. But his savings account had gone from zero to minus $2,000, meaning that the withdrawals he'd made had been reversed and the system had corrected itself. So the $2,000 he pulled from the ATM was now a debt in his account. And that's something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. The bank shouldn't have let him withdraw that money since it wasn't there. But in the end, regardless, the system corrected itself, and the money he took out became a debt in his account. The strange thing Dan noticed was that the statement didn't show any of the transfers. It didn't show that Dan had moved money from his credit card to his savings account. All the statement showed was that the balance in his savings account was now minus $2,000, as if the system didn't know where that money came from. It knew it had been withdrawn, but didn't know its source. So now, Dan was supposed to return that cash, the $2,000, to the bank to pay off his debt. But when he opened his wallet and saw the $2,000 in there, he said to himself, "Cash in hand is better than zero in the bank." Even if his account was in the negative, he didn't care. It was time to enjoy life, so he went straight to the store, started buying stuff for his house, and even got a new fridge for the kitchen. Then he called up his friends and invited them to the bar where he worked and threw a party. By the end of it, he was left with just $300 from the $2,000. So what did our genius decide to do? Instead of paying it back to the bank to cover some of his debt, he decided to gamble it, hoping to win big and pay off his debt quickly. One of the popular things in Australia, especially in pubs, is betting on horse races. You pick a horse, bet that it'll win, and put some money down. It's a form of gambling. As you can imagine, mixing alcohol and gambling in one place is how people lose all their money. The pub where Dan worked was partnered with a site called TAB, the biggest horse race betting site in Australia. Many pubs partnered with this site to offer its services through the pub. So customers would come in, hand over cash to the pub owner, and the owner would place the bet on the site since the pub was connected to the system. Dan decided to take the $300 he had left and bet it on horse races. By the end of the day, he had lost all $300 and went home with nothing in his pocket, on top of still owing the bank. Now, Dan started thinking about what he could do to solve the problem he was in and began replaying that night in his head when he managed to pull $2,000 from the ATM. How did it happen? Why did the ATM let him withdraw that money when it wasn't even in his account? Dan, despite his issues with drinking and gambling, was a smart guy who loved analyzing systems and figuring out how to exploit them. He wasn't a hacker, but he had a passion for tech and systems and liked understanding how to get around them. So, he started thinking about all the factors that happened that night. The first thing he realized was important was the time. The withdrawal had happened after midnight. He decided to try the same thing again, after midnight. And sure enough, a few days later, he finished his shift at the pub, closed up, and went to the same ATM he used last time. The first thing he did was put his savings account card into the machine, and sure enough, his balance showed as minus $2,000. He pulled the savings card out and inserted his credit card into the machine. His credit card balance was still the same, minus $1,995, close to its maxed out limit, as we mentioned earlier. So Dan did the same thing. He transferred $1,000 from his credit card to his savings account. The same error message popped up. Transaction failed, and the machine ejected his credit card. Then he inserted his savings card into the machine again, and this time the balance showed up. And surprise, his balance was minus $1,000, meaning that the $1,000 he tried to transfer from his credit card had somehow made it into his savings account, even though that wasn't supposed to happen. He went back to his credit card and transferred another $1,000, got the same transaction failed message again. But when he checked his savings account, the balance was now zero. Just like that, he had paid off his entire debt in a matter of minutes. Of course, Dan figured the system would probably correct itself later and put his account back to minus $2,000, but he thought, let me try withdrawing the money again. So he transferred $2,000 from his credit card to his savings account, got the error message again, but when he checked his savings account, it showed $2,000. He withdrew that $2,000, and the balance returned to zero in his savings account. Dan went home with a fresh $2,000 in his pocket. His account balance was now zero, but he knew the system would probably fix itself eventually. He just wanted to see when that would happen. He went to sleep that night, and the first thing he did when he woke up the next morning was call the bank and ask for a statement. His balance was still zero. The system hadn't corrected itself yet. He spent the entire day calling the bank every few hours to request a statement, and the result was always the same. The balance was still zero. The day ended, and the balance was still zero. He went to sleep, woke up the next morning, and called the bank at 6 a.m. And that's when things suddenly changed. His balance was now minus $4,000. This meant the system had corrected all the withdrawals Dan had made and reversed them. The first night, he withdrew $2,000, and on the second night, he withdrew another $2,000, bringing the total to negative $4,000. At this point, you might think this whole process wasn't worth it. Sure, Dan could pull out cash, but eventually the bank would notice when his balance reached a large negative amount. In fact, the bank has an automated system, and once the account hits negative $20,000, it gets frozen automatically, and the bank would definitely notice that. But the loophole was that the correction took more than a full day, more than 24 hours. Dan's theory was that after midnight, the bank's ATM went into standby mode, and while in this mode, it was disconnected from the bank's system. It stayed in this mode from 12 to 1 a.m., and that's why it allowed the transfer of money from the credit card to the savings account. It was just a glitch that wasn't supposed to happen. Now, since the correction took more than 24 hours, if Dan transferred money every night between 12 and 1 a.m., he could offset the negative balance from the previous day. How? Let me give you an example. If Dan withdrew $2,000 tonight, before that $2,000 turned into a negative balance in his account, the next night, he could transfer another $2,000. If he kept this process up every night, the balance wouldn't turn negative because the correction took more than 24 hours. If you didn't get the idea, you can reread this explanation, and I think you'll get it. The bottom line is that Dan had to do the transfer every night, and each time he withdrew money, he had to add that amount to the total balance. I know this might sound a bit confusing, so I'll give you another example. If we assume Dan withdrew $10,000 tonight, and the next night he wanted to withdraw another $10,000, he'd have to transfer $20,000 this time, $10,000 to cover the previous night, and $10,000 for the new withdrawal. And the night after that, if he wanted to withdraw $10,000 again, he'd have to transfer $30,000, $10,000 to cover the last night, and $10,000 for the night before that. The amount he'd have to transfer each night would gradually increase, but the good thing was that the machine allowed him to transfer up to 6 figures in one go, meaning he could transfer up to $999,000 in a single transaction. And if he wanted to transfer more, he could simply do another transaction. But he had to do this transfer every night. If he missed even one night, all the money he'd withdrawn over the previous nights would turn into a negative balance in his account. For example, if he had withdrawn $100,000 over the past few nights, his account would suddenly show negative $100,000, and the bank would immediately notice that, since it's a large amount. This isn't like minus $2,000 or minus $4,000. This is minus $100,000. I hope the idea is clear now. With that, I think Dan might be the only person in this world who could say he can pull money out of thin air. And he found out he could do this trick with any ATM from that bank. So he was living the good life, going to the ATM every night and withdrawing hefty amounts of money. According to him, he did feel a bit guilty at times, but he told himself he wasn't stealing from a specific person. He was just taking money from the bank. To Dan, the bank was just an evil institution stealing people's money. So why shouldn't he steal from them if the opportunity was right there? That's how he justified it to himself. Of course, he didn't tell anyone about it. It was his secret, kept even from his friends and his fiancée, who was a religious Christian and a teacher. She'd most likely be against it. Dan kept withdrawing money every night, and in the first week alone, he pulled out around $20,000. His favorite thing was treating his friends to drinks, and at the same time, he'd gamble on horse races. His friends would cheer him on and even help him pick the horses to bet on. Dan was living the high life, sometimes even treating everyone at the bar, saying, "It's on me." The people around him started wondering where all this money was coming from, knowing that he wasn't in a financial position to do these things. Dan would tell them he was making money from betting on horses, which made sense to them. But, in reality, Dan was losing a lot of money and was addicted to gambling. Even while working at the bar, he'd bet through the TAB website I mentioned earlier, the biggest betting site in Australia. Dan kept losing until his losses hit $40,000. Imagine, it got to the point where the betting site's management called the bar owner because, as I told you, the bar was partnered with the site. When Dan got to work, he found his manager on the phone with the site's management. They were explaining how one of his employees was betting crazy amounts, and they thought Dan was scamming them because the money he was using for bets wasn't showing up in the cash register. They suspected Dan was betting with his own money, without putting anything in the register. But the bar owner went and checked the register himself, and found the money was there. This puzzled him. Where is this guy getting all this cash from? He knew Dan's modest salary. Imagine, Dan was betting in a single day the same amount the bar would get from bets in a whole month. Naturally, these amounts raised suspicions. The TAB website closed Dan's account and banned him from betting on their platform. The bar owner also fired him, as everyone suspected Dan was doing something shady and illegal. The first thought that came to their minds was that Dan might be a drug dealer, so they cut ties with him immediately. Word started spreading in the small town Dan lived in. And as you know, in small towns, everybody knows everybody. So news travels fast. The news reached his fiancée. And imagine this. She broke up with him over a text message. She wrote, "I don't know what you're doing with your life, but I don't want any part of it. Consider us done." Dan felt like he needed someone to talk to, and the only person he could think of was his best friend Mark. He called Mark and told him the whole story. He said, "I've found a glitch in the ATM, and I can pull out as much money as I want." Mark replied, "That's your business. I don't want any part of it, but it doesn't change how I see you. You'll still be my friend, and we can still hang out like we always do." At that moment, it was the weekend, and Dan said to his friend, "How about we take a trip to Melbourne and have some fun there? My treat, of course." Mark was like, "Why not? Let's go." Melbourne was the city Dan originally lived in, as I mentioned at the beginning of the story, and I also told you he used to work at a casino there before moving to the small town of Wangaratta to be with his fiancée, who had now left him. Dan and his friend Mark took the train and headed to Melbourne. When they arrived, they checked into the Crown Towers Hotel, a 5-star luxury hotel. Dan stood in front of the massive window overlooking the city, and for the first time, he felt the real sense of wealth, seeing what money could do to improve the life he was living. But of course, even on this trip, he had to go out every night to find an ATM and do his daily transfer, because that was something he couldn't skip. The next day, Dan and his friend Mark went down to the casino in the hotel and started gambling with thousands of dollars. They hopped from one game to another, losing more and more each time, but they didn't care about the money since they had an endless supply. Every night, they'd head down to the casino, playing and blowing through more money than they'd earn in a whole year. After a few days, Mark had to head back to Wangaratta because he had work, but Dan decided to stay in Melbourne because, well, life there was better, especially when you've got unlimited cash. The only thing that annoyed Dan was withdrawing money from the ATM. No matter how much he wanted to take out, he was limited by how much cash was in the machine, which often wasn't enough for the huge amounts he wanted. So, Dan decided to take a bold step. His balance had hit $500,000, and we're still in the first month. If he wanted to pull out something big like $100,000, he'd have to go inside the bank to get it, which terrified him because he knew deep down he was stealing. The whole time, he was afraid the bank would catch on at any moment, call him, or worse, have the cops after him. Going into the bank to withdraw cash inside took a crazy amount of courage. After a few days of hesitation, he decided to try it out, but carefully. He wanted to be smart about it, so he started small. The first time, he only asked for $1,000, an amount he could have easily gotten from the ATM, but he wanted to see how they'd react inside. He walked into the bank, nervous, went up to the teller, handed over his info and ID, and asked for $1,000. The teller said, "Sure," and gave him the money. Dan casually asked, "By the way, what's my balance now?" The teller checked and said, "You have $537,327. Dan thanked him, feeling a wave of relief inside. The next time, he withdrew more, $20,000, and again, it went off without a hitch. He walked out of the bank with the cash, no issues. On the third try, he decided to go for a big amount, $100,000. But this time, before giving him the cash, the teller went to the back, probably to get the manager's approval. Dan waited for about 15 minutes, feeling incredibly anxious the whole time, shaking inside, scared they'd figured him out and were calling the cops. But after those 15 minutes, the teller came back and handed him the full $100,000 in cash. Now, Dan wasn't limited by how much he could pull from an ATM. He could take whatever amount he wanted directly from the bank. Despite everything, Dan was convinced deep down that he'd get caught sooner or later, so he had to make the most of this time and enjoy the money while he could. He figured one day he'd be caught and probably end up spending a long time in jail. Dan called up a group of his friends, including his close buddy Mark, and told them to take some time off work and come to Melbourne. He told them, "I'll put you guys up in the fanciest hotels. We'll eat at the best restaurants and live a life we never dreamed of." His friends were surprised since they didn't know the whole story, but they were in. There were 4 of them: Dan, Mark, and 2 others whose names or faces we don't know. Dan told one of the other 2 about the whole thing, the glitch he'd found in the ATM. As for the last friend, he said, "I don't want to know the details. I'll just enjoy the ride with you guys, but I don't want to get involved in anything over my head." So now, 2 of Dan's friends knew the story, and the 3rd was just along for the fun. The 4 of them went all over the city, staying at the fanciest hotels, dining at the best restaurants, and shopping at the most expensive stores. They were spending insane amounts of money, and whenever they moved from one place to another, they'd only ride in limos. Sometimes they even took helicopters to get to restaurants or bars. Dan would cover the bill for everyone in the bar or restaurant, telling the staff that he had it all covered. If they met someone they vibed with, they'd invite them to their parties. Sometimes Dan would rent out entire hotel pools to throw parties, or book the penthouse suite, the massive apartment at the top of the hotel, for another party. There were even times when he'd rent out an entire floor of a hotel, and the party would turn into a huge gathering full of dancing, drinking, girls, and even drugs. That's how life was for them during that period, and Dan never held back. Anyone who crossed his path got a cut. If they went to a restaurant, the tips were in the hundreds of dollars. If they took a limo, the driver got a huge tip. The hotel workers were getting their share too. Anyone who met Dan was lucky, and of course his friends were at the top of the list. Anything they wanted, he bought it for them immediately. He even paid off all their massive student loans. Another thing Dan did, one time he was walking down the street and saw a guitarist playing. He liked the music, but no one was really paying attention. So Dan went up and paid people to gather around the guitarist and gave the guy thousands of dollars. In another instance, Dan was in a restaurant and met an elderly couple whose dream was to travel to Hawaii, but they couldn't afford the trip. They had settled for a domestic trip within Australia instead. Dan handed them $40,000 in cash so they could go to Hawaii. Dan also had a habit of walking down the street and finding homeless people or those without a place to stay. He'd book them a night in a luxury hotel. One time, the Hilton called him because the person he had booked a room for had stolen towels, irons, and a coffee machine. Dan just laughed and told the hotel he'd pay for it all. He was doing all this stuff and having fun because he had endless money, so why not share it? It made him happy to see people's reactions, and at the same time, it helped ease the guilt he was feeling. He probably saw himself as a kind of Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Of course, Dan wasn't skimping on himself or his friends either. They'd go to the fanciest clothing stores, buy the most expensive perfumes and clothes. Whatever they wanted was theirs, and they always kept up appearances. There was no way they were going to spend all that money wearing regular clothes. They had to be dressed in the finest stuff, rocking the latest trends. One time, Dan made a reservation at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, and after they finished their meal, he paid the tab for every table in the restaurant, even though the people there didn't really need anyone to cover their bills. One of the waitresses came up to Dan and asked, "Are you the richest guy in Australia?" He laughed and said, "There are definitely people richer than me. I'd say I'm number 7. The wealth he was flaunting was drawing attention, especially from some women who tried to take advantage of him. But of course, Dan wasn't stingy. If he met a girl and took her out, he'd buy her jewelry, clothes, and expensive things. But some girls were greedy, asking for large sums of money or outrageously expensive items. If Dan felt like one of them was trying to use him, he'd drop her immediately. And, of course, it wasn't hard to replace her. With that kind of money, you can find 1,000 other girls, especially ones who are only attracted to the cash. Through all of this, the parties, restaurants, bars, shopping, and wild living, Dan made sure he never missed a night of withdrawing money from the ATM. If he missed even one night, the whole thing would be over. So, he set alarms on his phone for just before midnight, waking him up with the loudest sound so he could go to the machine and handle his business between 12 and 1 a.m. In just 4 months, Dan had stolen over $1 million from the bank, and the bank had no idea what was happening. You might ask, did Dan really spend over $1 million in 4 months? Yeah, believe it or not. One time, he rented a private jet for $90,000 and flew to an island near Bali in Indonesia, spending 2 days there. He rented out the entire island. You might wonder, how did he spend 2 days away from the ATM? The answer is, he gave one of his friends his bank card and had him handle the withdrawals. Throughout the trip, he kept calling his friend to make sure everything was going smoothly. During those 4 months, Dan was convinced he'd be caught at any moment. The bank would figure it out, maybe even call the cops. And even though he was enjoying the money and living lavishly, he was constantly anxious and afraid. He wasn't sleeping well, and every time he felt that anxiety, he drowned it in alcohol, which only made things worse. After those wild 4 months, that's how Dan's life ended. He felt like he'd reached his limit and just couldn't live with the anxiety and fear inside him anymore. There was a sense of guilt and shame weighing him down. So he spent way more money than he had. He gathered his 3 friends and told them, "I've decided to stop. I can't keep going. The stress is just too much for me." At first, his friends were bummed by the news, but they understood. Then he said, "I'll go on one last run with you all, and each of you can take whatever you want, whether it's cash or something else. I don't care anymore." Dan made his last transfer and gave his friends whatever they asked for, and in the end, the total amount he had withdrawn from the bank reached $1.6 million, a huge sum. After that, for the first time in 4 months, he stopped going to the ATM and didn't make any more transfers. Of course, the $1.6 million would show up in his account as negative. Dan and his friends left the city and went back to his small hometown of Wangaratta. After that, Dan stayed in a hotel, keeping around $80,000 in cash stored in the hotel's bathroom and room. He sat there, expecting any moment to get a call from the bank, or maybe have the cops bust in and arrest him, because he was sure the bank had realized his account was $1.6 million in the red. A few days later, he got a call from the bank. He answered, and they said, "We've noticed some strange activity in your account. Can you explain what's going on?" Dan replied, "I don't know. You guys tell me." They said, "We're going to investigate and get back to you. If we find out you've done anything illegal, we'll report it to the police. And just so you know, don't even think about running or trying to avoid this." Dan said, "Okay," and stayed at the hotel, waiting. A day went by, then 2, and then an entire month without hearing anything. Dan decided to call the bank himself because the waiting was driving him crazy. It's hard to live comfortably when you're constantly scared you might end up in jail at any moment. He called the bank and asked them for an update. A woman answered and asked him to hold. He stayed on hold for more than 20 minutes before a guy named Bernie, who seemed like a manager or someone higher up, got on the line. Bernie said, "Mr. Dan, you won't be taking any more money, and I think you know why." Dan replied, "I don't want any more money. I just want to know what's going on." Bernie, in a scolding tone, said, "You've been a bad boy." He continued to lecture Dan like he was a school kid. Dan apologized, but Bernie said, "You're going to jail, and the police are handling it now. You've ruined your life." After that call, Dan was sure the police would show up at any moment to arrest him. He stayed in his hotel room, waiting. The police would have no trouble finding him since the hotel was booked under his name, and if they searched their system, they'd find him right away. Another whole month passed with no word from the bank, the police, or anyone else. That's when Dan decided to leave Melbourne and go back to his small town of Wangaratta, especially since his cash reserves were quickly running out. Dan returned to Wangaratta and waited there, thinking the police would eventually call or come for him. But months went by, and nothing happened. During that time, there was constant communication between him and the bank. The bank kept threatening him with arrest and jail time. Imagine this went on for over a year, then 2, without anything actually happening. The bank just kept threatening him, but never took any action. Dan lived in a constant state of fear and anxiety. He reached out to some lawyers to ask about the case, but even the lawyers couldn't give him any answers because the situation was so bizarre and unheard of. He continued waiting, with the bank threatening him for 2 years, calling him to say the case was under investigation and that he was going to jail. Dan couldn't live a normal life, or figure out if the bank was just stalling, or if they were actually unable to take action. By the start of 2014, more than 2 years after Dan had started his operation, he couldn't handle the pressure anymore. He wasn't in jail, but he wasn't free either. He was living under a constant threat. So he decided to do something to force the bank to respond. He turned to the media and started telling his story himself. First, he reached out to one of the most famous newspapers in Australia and gave them his story. They published an article about him, and a journalist even interviewed him, setting up a photo shoot of Dan wearing a suit on a private jet. The article was published, and for the first time, Dan's story became public knowledge. But the article didn't get enough traction to push the bank to respond. That's when Dan decided to take things to the next level. This time, he contacted Current Affair, one of Australia's most popular TV shows. When the producers at Current Affair heard Dan's story, they were hooked. They invited him for a photo shoot and started preparing a special TV episode about him. It went on for a week, and they went all out. They rented a hotel, cars, and a plane, filming scenes to represent Dan's life during those wild 4 months he spent with the bank's money and his parties. After shooting the episode, Dan had to wait a few weeks for them to finish editing and get the episode ready to air. This show had millions of viewers, so Dan was sure the bank would react once the story aired, and he'd finally know where he stood in all of this. He was excited and eager to see his story hit TV. When the big day came, Dan sat down to watch from the start. They aired the report, told the story, and covered everything. It was a bit summarized and didn't include all the details, but it got the point across well enough. But what really surprised Dan was that the anchor at the end of the story said something strange. She mentioned that there was an arrest warrant out for him and that he needed to report his location to the police. Dan was sitting there, totally confused. How could there be a warrant for his arrest when he wasn't on the run? They had just spent a whole week filming with him. How could he suddenly be a fugitive? That night, after the show aired, one of the producers emailed Dan, saying it was a pleasure to meet him, that he was a great guy, and that they hoped he was happy with the final episode. But Dan wasn't happy, especially with what happened at the end of the story. In the same email, the producer told him that if Dan wanted to pick up the pictures and documents from the shoot, he could stop by the channel's office the following Thursday. Dan immediately realized this was a trap. He was confused by everything that had happened, but he wanted to get it over with. If there was a warrant, he wanted to get arrested. So on Thursday, Dan went to the TV station, and as soon as he walked in, he was surrounded by photographers from every angle. Then a cop showed up and said, "You're under arrest." And all of this was happening right in front of the station's cameras, which were filming the whole scene. That's when Dan understood why they did it. They wanted to end their story with his arrest, making it look like they were the heroes who caught the criminal. Nobody cared that Dan had been waiting for the bank or the police to take action this whole time. And he was the one who reached out to them first. Dan was taken to the police station, fingerprinted, but without any investigation or interview, he was thrown straight into holding. After getting a lawyer assigned to him, Dan's lawyer told him some unbelievable things. First off, the cop who arrested him wasn't even investigating the case. The TV producer had called the cop and asked him to come arrest Dan, so it was all just for show in front of the cameras, and the cop didn't know anything about the case. That's why there was no investigation or interview. The whole arrest was based on the TV episode where Dan himself admitted what he did. The police weren't even investigating the case, and there wasn't even an open case to begin with. The bank never reported anything to the police. This is when Dan realized that all the bank's threats were empty, and the bank didn't want to expose itself because if word got out that someone managed to steal over $1.6 million due to a mistake in their systems, their customers would leave, their stock would plummet, and they'd lose tens of times the amount that was stolen. Dan didn't grasp all of this until after he was arrested. So, what happens next? Imagine that even after Dan's arrest, the bank refused to be involved in the case because if they got involved, they'd have to reveal their records and accounts, exposing the mistake that allowed Dan to steal such a massive amount of money. So, they chose to stay out of it. But once Dan's story went public, the case had to go to court because Dan had admitted on TV to stealing the money. How could he walk away without a trial? The other side in the case wasn't the bank. It was the district attorney who took it on since the bank refused to be involved. If the bank had been part of the case and revealed all the details, it would have been a huge scandal for them, and Dan might have ended up in jail for a very long time. But since the bank wasn't involved and the details of the case weren't even clear to the judge or the DA, Dan was sentenced to just 1 year in prison. After serving his time, Dan got out. To this day, Dan appears on TV shows, podcasts, and even on YouTube, telling his story in full detail. It seems like he's writing a book about his story, and there's even a movie in the works about his life. In one interview, someone asked him, "Did you keep any of that money in cash or move it to an offshore account?" Dan replied, "No comment." This probably means he still has some of it, maybe a lot. It's possible that the amount he withdrew from the bank was more than $1.6 million. The number the bank mentioned wasn't confirmed, and they never released any figures themselves. And so, that's the crazy and strange story of Dan Sanders. Honestly, I want to know, if you guys found a glitch like this in the bank's ATM, what would you do? I'm really curious to see your comments. And hey, I hope none of you are thieves. Just kidding. And with that, we've reached the end of our story. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell for notifications. And here are some awesome videos you can check out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.